Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Birchbark Editing's In Conversation event featuring Denton Loving and Erika Nichols Frazer. I'm your host tonight, Max Frazer, no relation. And along with my co-founder, Catherine Parnell, we want to thank you for coming tonight. If you keep an eye on the chat, we'll be sending links to you to help you find our upcoming opportunities, and as well as these authors' websites and places where you can purchase their fabulous books. We hope you can watch our events page for upcoming author readings and conversations, including Lauren K. Johnson and Matt Gallagher on June 27th. And if you haven't already, you're going to want to head over to Microlit Almanac to see our new fiction, nonfiction, poetry. And now we have our newest offering, which is reviews. We also offer mix and meet sessions. They're online gatherings for conversation and inspiration, and they include a writing prompt or two. Check it out, and if you want, you can join us on June 6th for our next time. We're so excited to be hosting Denton and Erika, who will be talking about their latest books and their writing process. And I'll begin by reading you their bios, and then Erika will start off the reading. Denton Loving is the author of the poetry collections Crimes Against Birds from Main Street Rag and Tamp from Mercer University Press. He is also the editor of Seeking Its Own Level, an anthology of writings about water from MotesBooks. For over a decade, he co-directed the Mountain Heritage Literary Festival at Lincoln Memorial University, where he also co-edited Drafthorse, the literary journal of work and no work. He has received scholarships and fellowships from organizations such as the Collegeville Institute for Ecumenical and Cultural Research, the Eckerd College Writers Conference, and the Key West Literary Seminars. He earned the Master of Fine Arts in Writing and Literature from Bennington College in Bennington, Vermont. He is a co-founder and editor of EastOver Press and its literary journal, Cutleaf. His writing has appeared in numerous publications, including Iron Horse Literary Review, Kenyon Review, Tupelo Quarterly, the Chattahoochee Review, Harvard Divinity Bulletin, and the Threepenny Review. Erika Nichols Frazer is the author of the memoir Feed Me, a story of food, love, and mental illness, as well as the forthcoming poetry collection Staring Too Closely, available in August of 2023 from Main Street Rag. Her essays, poetry, and short stories have appeared in journals such as River Teeth's Beautiful Things, Gone Long, Emerge Literary Journal, Red Fern Review, and elsewhere. She has an MFA from the Bennington Writing Seminars, and she lives in Vermont, where she works as a staff writer at her local newspaper and a freelance editor. And now I'll turn things over to Erika.
Thanks, Max and Kat, and thank you to everyone who's here tonight, as well as to Denton. It's an honor to be here speaking with you. I am going to read a short excerpt from my memoir, Feed Me. I know we have some Bennington folks, so it's glary so you can't see it, but we have some Bennington folks here, so I'm going to read a section that actually takes place at Bennington during one of our residencies. But I wanted to start by reading the epigraphs, which are just two quotes I really love that I think give you a little bit of a sense of my book. The first is, I fed myself like a woman who needed to love the world again. That's by Carmen Maria Machado from her essay Meals of My 20s from Eat Joy. And then the other one is, there is nothing stronger than a broken woman who has rebuilt herself, which is from Hannah Gadsby's special Nanette on Netflix. I'm going to read an excerpt that comes towards the end of the book in part 3, which is Rest. And this essay is called Fake Meat. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I will read an excerpt from it. Do you ever finish a plate of food? A guy from my MFA workshop asked. We were friendly, but didn't know each other well. Certainly not well enough to criticize each other's eating habits, in my opinion. We'd been discussing Emily Wilson's new translation of the Odyssey, while I pushed suspicious-looking fake meat around my plate. It was gray and limp and sort of sad. I wasn't sure what it was trying to be, but it definitely wasn't succeeding. We were in the dining hall and had a little time to kill before the evening faculty reading. He was done with his dinner, plate cleaned, and I continued to swirl the rubbery vegan meat into the soggy squash and zucchini on my plate. Not here, I said in a joking tone, trying to keep it light and suggest it was about the cafeteria food, which was generally pretty good, rather than my eating habits or mental health. The truth was, no, I didn't always finish a full plate of food, especially at places like dining halls, even decent ones like this, with a lot of local ingredients. Something about all the people put pressure on me. Also, I easily got distracted talking about literature and ended up with a plate of cold food. But mostly, it was because anxiety was so heightened at those 10-day residencies. There were triggers everywhere: the cafeteria, discussing a rape scene in a workshop, a lecture about mothers, offensive portrayals of people living with mental illness, and well meaning strangers commenting on my eating habits. I do like to reward myself with food and admittedly have gained weight over the past few years and feel self-conscious about it. I catch myself judging my appearance in reflective surfaces, examining the curve of my belly, tugging at pants and dresses that have gotten tighter. I still have doubts about my body all the time. And a few years ago, when I felt like my husband Dylan didn't want me, it made me even more self-conscious about my seemingly undesirable body. Still, I don't count calories or obsess over food or even own a scale, and yet I do constantly compare myself to others and put more premium on my own weight and physical appearance than I know I should. It's a hard habit to break. My workshop acquaintances' comment bristled me, though. It told me people had been watching. It made me aware of my body in an uncomfortable way. It felt like I was back in middle school, with everybody analyzing every bite I took and every bite I refused to take. Teachers watching me to eat to report back to my parents and the school psychologist. I've been caught. I made sure to eat a cookie in front of that guy. I'd been nervous about coming back to Bennington this time after my mental health and marriage had imploded. Being in the process of losing my grandfather to Alzheimer's these last several months, rebuilding with Dylan, and dealing with my complex emotions around my mother had distracted me from the work of my MFA program. I'd barely been able to keep up and knew what I did manage to produce was poor. I felt on the edge of failure and that any setbacks or triggers could push me closer to the inevitable fall. It had been days since had more than an hour or two of sleep, and I hadn't been eating much, often staying in my room during meals, lying in my twin bed, half awake, mind buzzing, shaking from too much coffee. I couldn't stop talking to myself or anyone who would listen, moving, pacing, scratching at my skin. In conversations, I just kept rambling on, too fast, and I knew I should shut up, but my words seemed to be coming independently from me, like I wasn't in control. I didn't yet know that this was mania. It's violent, on fire, it's ravenous, it'll swallow you whole. It buzzes with ferocious energy, it's restless, can't stop moving, can't slow down, volume up too loud. Thoughts pinballing, never landing or connecting or making sense. It's a desperate need to move, to take action without thought of consequence. It's a live wire spitting sparks. It rattles you, strips you, overfills, then empties you. During the previous semester, Ellen, my best friend at Bennington, and the only person I'd ever met who really understood my mental illness, had to drop out due to an abusive relationship. Her life was in danger, and as a recovering addict, she had to work hard to stay sober and couldn't keep up with her assignments. I'd helped her create a schedule that she could agree to in which to turn in the late work. But a few weeks into the semester, still behind from semester one, she texted me that she couldn't do it and had to withdraw. I was devastated and felt guilty at being the one who had barely made it through the semester. It felt like it should have been me. And now I had to be at Bennington for the first time without her, my support system. During this third residency, I went to as many lectures and readings as I could handle. There were times when getting out of bed was too hard. I had to leave in the middle of a lecture about mothers that triggered my anxiety around my fractured relationship with my mother, and as it was 17 below out and my instinct to run away didn't seem like a good idea, I paced the hallway outside of the classroom where the other students could see me through the window. Walking in circles, shaking, itching, snapping my hair tie at my wrist, talking to myself, bursting out of my skin. My teeth chattered, skin itched, body couldn't stop moving. I was usually able to hide my anxiety better in front of people, but knew that this time I looked what I thought of as normal people might expect from a crazy person. I was ashamed of the panic and anxiety boiling over in me. I didn't want to be like this, but I felt that I had no control over my own body and mind. The bad wolf was winning. Eventually, I made it back to my room, barely holding back tears, and took an alprazolam, my new emergency-only meds, which had been prescribed after my panic attacks during the previous residency. At first, the pills worked immediately. I could breathe. My heartbeat slowed. I could stop moving. The next day, I had a meeting with my new professor, a writer whom I love, and I was nervous. I wanted to impress her, to show her what a talented writer I was, but I was questioning my ability to keep up with the rigors of the program. When the professor asked me about the previous semester, I broke down crying in the cafeteria. It felt like my life had been falling apart around me, and I could barely write a coherent sentence. I was ashamed of the work I'd handed in, of not being able to be better. I was afraid that I couldn't do it, that I would fail. I couldn't control the tears. I sense a little anxiety, she said patiently. You're in the woods right now. Look up. We're right there with you. After the meeting, my heart was still beating too fast. Tears barely held at bay. I took another alprazolam and relaxed. A few days later, I felt trapped in a room full of friends, panicked, invisible, yet sure that they'd see my anxiety and realize I was nuts. I had to excuse myself to take another pill so I could calm down and participate in the conversation. One wasn't working anymore, so I took two. The bottle said take 1 to 2 as needed, and it felt needed. My hands shook so much as I struggled to open the bottle that a few pills spilled down the vent in the floor. I was jittery, euphoric, outside of myself. The person I became on them scared me. I stopped taking them. On the last day of this third residency, though I didn't feel in control of my body, I somehow made the 3-hour drive home, talking to myself the entire way. I stayed up all night and wrote 200 pages of nonsense. I posted long diatribes on Facebook. I scribbled notes like, call John Oliver, sure that he'd want to hear some of my ideas. I spent more than $200 on books I didn't have time to read. I believed I could see spoken words. I wrote transcripts of what was playing on TV, convinced there was some sort of greater meaning behind it, that I was discovering some secret plot or subliminal message. You're talking to yourself again, Dylan said more than once, not hiding his impatience. I rocked back and forth, couldn't stop moving, couldn't stay still. It felt like everyone around me was moving in slow motion. It felt like I was my brightest self and resented that Dylan didn't see the world the way I was seeing it. It felt like he was judging me, like he always wanted to make me ordinary, the way people, my family, had always wanted to make me normal, make me into something else. I feel like you still haven't come home, he said after a week. At our couples therapist, he confirmed what I had always worried, that I was too much. He said how difficult this was for him, how he had barely slept. If you have to go away for a few days, I understand, but I can't control this, I told him. You seem way too okay with the idea of me leaving, he said. It felt like I couldn't win. I knew I didn't want to run away again. I knew I needed to stay home, to be in a familiar space, to try to slow my thoughts and my body. I needed his help, but I worried it was too much for him. Dylan wanted me to promise that things would get better, that I would never be like this again, which was a promise I couldn't make. I said I'd try my best, do everything I could, but I knew there would be more days like this. I can't put up with this, he said, and I heard, I can't love all the broken parts in you. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm very pleased to hand it over to Denton and looking forward to hearing your work.
Thanks, Erika. I want to say what an honor it is to read with you and how great it was to hear that chapter. It's such a powerful chapter. It's really good. Thank you. And I also want to thank Max and Kat for having us tonight. It's a pleasure to be here on this this sort of space, and I appreciate the work that you all have done to create this. So I'm going to read to you tonight from my book of poetry, Tamp. And the book is a collection of poems that could easily be described as being about grief, but I hope that they're about a lot more than only grief. They center a lot around my father, my relationship with my father, and the process that I underwent after my dad's passing. And so I think I'll start with the very first poem in the book, which is called Hurtling. I'm 5 again, and it's so dark I can't see the road. Are we going through a tunnel? My dead father says no, go back to sleep. He reaches across the bench seat. The weight of his hand quiets the starlings in my belly. I know I'm safe as long as he's close. Within the darkness, stars pinprick the horizon. The small blue egg inside my breastbone cracks with understanding. We're not sweeping through a tunnel under the crush of a mountain. We're hurtling across the heavens on the wings of an ancient magical bird. I'm going to read a poem for Max, who shared with me that she had shared this poem with a class that she's teaching, and I really appreciate that. It's a really wonderful thing for teachers to share your work with emerging writers. So this poem is called Foundation, and I would just stress that a lot of these poems are written after my father's passing, but my dad was not well for a long time, and so I was had really started the grieving process before my dad passed away, and this poem speaks to that. I think it's called Foundation. Unable to stand in our hillside orchard, too weak to swing a mattock or to wrestle with dirt, my dad wants to plant peach trees. For him, I tear the earth open. Rocks bleed out from the poor mountain soil, and I unwrap swaddled peach roots. Before I scrape the dirt back and tamp it down, I return the largest rock under the young roots, a surrogate for what I fear. I bury it back, imagine the roots encircling the rock, enclosing it, building from its foundation, like the hard stone buried in the sweetest fruit. So there was a reference in that poem to a word, Tamp, which is the title of my collection. But a poem that was I think written or finished prior to that was this poem that's The Fence Builder. And this is really where the title of the collection comes from. The Fence Builder. My graves don't rise or sink, the gravedigger says after I show him the place to bury my father. I take in the view as if this valley is what he'll see for eternity. Down the hill, children play outside the elementary school. Sheep pasture around the cemetery. Some people just push their pile of dirt back in, but I tamp the dirt at every level. I'd never wondered why some graves swell and some settle and sag, but the gravedigger's words stay with me. He taps the clay above my sleeping dad, leveling the damp ground, just as the man in the casket taught me to tamp around wooden posts to make a new fence last, packing the dirt and rocks so wire is pulled taut, forced to hold tight for at least a generation. Those rhythmic strikes, a refrain for all who take pride in a task well done. Those men who work the earth, the fence builder erecting his monuments, the gravedigger and all he lays to rest. A lot of these poems take place or have something to do with the place where I live, which is a piece of farmland in East Tennessee that was very meaningful to my dad and that he passed to me. And so this is about one of the barns on the property, and it's called This is a Barn. I'm sorry, There is a Barn. There is a barn in this poem, built by men a century ago. No one alive remembers exactly, but someone cut the oaks and sawed the planks, nailed tin sheets to shape the roof. This barn sits by a creek. Some springs the creek overflows and the barn floods. There is a hayloft in this barn, and many poles between the rafters where tobacco once hung to cure. Gaps between the boards let fresh air enter. Below the loft, the barn is divided into stables. Horse tack still hangs in some, though no one alive remembers those horses. Out of hard labor, calves have been born here and died. So too womb-locked mothers. In the last stall, a man I knew stacked square hay bales as tight as mice, though the hay was thick with thistles. The following fall, the cattle were sold, the pastures left fallow, the man died, and the hay moldered. Did I mention this barn is black? Its roof, too. The man who packed the hay picked the paint, though there were red barns in his history. Perhaps the barn's color doesn't matter, except to me, because that man was my father. God alone knows if it makes any difference. The hay was wasted by all but the mice, always burrowing through the past. Cows are a subject that come up a lot in my poems because of having grown up on this farmland in East Tennessee. And this is a poem called Hagstone, Heckstone, Holystone. The farmer enters the mouth of the barn. In shadow, he palms the weathered oak beam above the stable door, feels for a rusty nail to hang a string of baling twine, the other end threaded to a rock with an eye in its center. A natural hole, created by the witchery of water pouring through the stone over time. Hagstone, Heckstone, Holystone, to save his cattle from bad dreams while they're pendulous with unborn calves. He bids his cows good night, trades barn dark for the widening maw of dusk. In his own bed, he counts the years he rifled dry riverbanks, sinking a stone with enough magic to lock so many perils in its threshold. And for peace to ease his own sleep, to wash away his fears of midnight births, twisted hooves, calves turned backwards, sideways, of umbilical cords wrapped around necks like nooses. My dad was somebody who was incredibly talented. He could do all kinds of things, but the one thing that he could never do was find the tool that he needed when he needed it. And so I had to include that fact in this poem. If there's an angel of lost gloves. If there's an angel of lost gloves, my father didn't believe and didn't wait for holy intercession. He mislaid his gloves faster than his temper. He wasn't careless, though I never knew him to lay hands on the tool he needed when he needed it. So he bought pair after pair, suede cowhide, fit to stretch barbed wire. Still, he usually worked with only one hand sheathed, and sometimes then with the fingers blown out, each digit ruptured by the snag of steel points, reaching next to rip open skin. Now I find his leather fingers cupping air like wren nest, lingering in buckets, on shud shelves, on the aged oak floor of the barn loft, in the midst of a task, maybe a pair of nails within reach, as if he'll return when he finds his hammer. And one of the things that my dad most often needed tools for was repairing a lawnmower. When you live on a hill farm in Tennessee, there are always a lot of reasons why your mower stops working for one reason or another. So this poem is called Riding Lawnmower. After the first small engine repairman tells me 5 miles is too far for a house call or a pickup, the second repairman tells me I should disassemble the mower myself, bring him the offending portion. Lincoln said his father taught him to work, but never to like it. My father taught me to work on lawnmowers. So, of course, I think about buying a new one. Instead, I crawl onto summer warm grass like my father taught me. I pull S pins and retaining springs, freeing suspension arms and the anti-sway bar, separating clutch rod from clutch lever. I mechanic my way beyond my skill set until the mulching deck falls limp. A pneumatic drill unlocks frozen, broken blades turned upside down, new ones hex bolt on, naked edges glinting in the light. I reverse engineer, reattach metal to metal, secure it all with a taut pulley belt. Such unbindings and rebindings are common. This tractor and I will again tame briar hills of blackberry, wild rose. We will battle stones rising quietly in the pasture at night like ghosts. There is no choice but to keep going, to keep working until the final unfixable end. And I definitely want us to have plenty of time. I'm anxious to talk to Erika about her book. So I'll end on this last poem, which is called Genealogy. To be the son of a coal miner is to be a child of mountains. And to be a child of mountains is to be Appalachian. And to be Appalachian is to be frontier and pioneer. And to be frontier and pioneer is to be Boone's cousin. And to be Boone's cousin is to be Long Hunter. And to be Long Hunter is to be Tuckahoe and Buckskin. And to be Tuckahoe and Buckskin is to be a son of Pocahontas. And to be a son of Pocahontas is to be Powhatan. To be Powhatan is to be Tidewater. And to be Tidewater is to be settler and planter. And to be settler and planter is to be enslaved and enslaver. And to be enslaved and enslaver is to be disinherited. And to be disinherited is to be a second son. And to be a second son is to be cavalier. And to be cavalier is to be Catholic and Protestant. And to be Catholic and Protestant is to lose your head. And to lose your head is to take a head or two. And to take a head or two is to be Lancastrian and Yorkist. And to be Lancastrian and Yorkist is to be the devil's daughter. And to be the devil's daughter is to be a friend of Dante. And to be a friend of Dante is to boil in the seventh circle. And to boil in the seventh circle is to be a fratricide. And to be a fratricide is to be a king. To be a king is to wear a crown. And to wear a crown is to be a conqueror. And to be a conqueror is to be a bastard. And to be a bastard is to be chosen by God. And to be chosen by God is to be a saint. To be a saint is to be a scourge and a plague. And to be a scourge and a plague is to be barbarian and pagan. And to be barbarian and pagan is to be the son of a bear. And to be the son of a bear is to be a senator. And to be a senator is to be a Roman imperialist. And to be a Roman imperialist is to be the twin son of a wolf. And to be the twin son of a wolf is to be an emperor. And to be an emperor is to be Julio Claudian. And to be Julio Claudian is to be the son of Aphrodite the mother. And to be the son of Aphrodite the mother is to be Greek. And to be Greek is to be ancient. And to be ancient is to be prehistoric. And to be prehistoric is to be mythical, is to be mythological. And to be mythological is to be a Trojan prince. And to be a Trojan prince is to be a son of a shepherd. And to be a son of a shepherd is to be a son of Zeus. And to be a son of Zeus is to be descended from Titans. To be descended from Titans is to be a god. To be a god is to be divinely human. And to be divinely human is to be pre-Adamite. And to be pre-Adamite is to be shaped from particles of dust. And to be shaped from particles of dust is to be a scion of stars. Thank you again. So,
well, thank you, Denton.
yeah, thank you. I'm excited to talk to you. As I was reading your book, there were so many different things that connected with me, even though it was not necessarily my story. And there are a lot of things I want to talk to you about. First of all, I just would like if you could talk to us a little bit about the idea of how you frame your entire work on the idea of how you connect with others with food. And I think that's so interesting. And it seems to me that there's this ongoing connection in that same way that you're now connecting with people through writing, particularly through the story. But again, it goes back to food. Can you talk about some of that?
Yeah. So It's interesting because I was writing this memoir and I didn't really make that connection to food. And I think I didn't really fully understand what like the central question was that I was answering, or what the sort of thread was. I just felt the need to write this story after I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and I'd been through you know, pretty intensive experiences of sort of learning how to cope with that. And food was a huge part of that, both me preparing meals for myself and my husband, but sharing with others and creating community around that, which for me is incredibly important to my mental health recovery and coping with mental health, is to tap into that community. And for me, both writing creates that community as well as does sharing meals together. And I do write a chapter in here called Potluck Culture, which is all about in our 20s when my husband and I lived in Burlington, Vermont. We're both Vermonters. We would have a weekly potluck at our house, every week, and upwards of 20 people would come to our little 1-bedroom apartment and cook and share food together, right? And that was such an important experience and like touchstone for me at that time when I was kind of struggling to have that community and to be able to feed them and feed each other and have that experience together. And that's sort of similar in a way, even though writing is a very solitary experience, to be able to commune with others and like share that passion and have those discussions and talk about books, like my experience at Bennington helped create that community for me. So while those are different things, both reading, writing, and creating food, cooking, preparing, are really helpful for me to ease my anxiety and also to connect with others.
I love that. And I love that chapter that you're referencing in your 20s, where these people would all come to your tiny little apartment. I loved how you described how there would be almost random people that you barely knew that you would meet them and they would say, "Oh yeah, you're the people who do the potluck." And you say, "Yeah, you should come over and come do
Yeah.
potluck with us." And it just seemed like it grew into this wonderfully fun thing.
Totally. And yeah, to speak more to your question too about the connection with food, just I feel like I need to give credit to my friend Victoria Sotosanti, who's a great writer, who I met at Vermont Studio Center in 2020. We were there during the pandemic, and so it was this sort of strange, like desert land, like there were very few people there. But we would connect in the afternoons, go swimming, and she read a piece of mine that actually Kat and Max published in their in Birch Bark Editing's Microlit Almanac, that I'd written while there about butter. Is part of where this book kind of started. And she was the one who said to me, I think you're really writing a collection about food here and mental health and that connection, right? And that's what kind of like drilled that in for me and made that connection. And when I started looking at that and realizing how connected food was to all of these experiences, and into my recovery process and healing process, and sort of started looking at it from a different lens. Um, I mean, I loved everything that you shared, and I loved all the poems in this book. I was particularly excited to hear you read Genealogy in your voice. I loved like the rhythm and the cadence that one had. And it spoke to me like that poem, I feel like is so central to many of the themes that I noted, which, yes, as you mentioned, grief, certainly. But I also feel like identity and sense of place and like connectedness to our families, each other, the places that we live, and the land. And I like something that Max said before we got started. She was talking about how, she lives in a totally different part of the country, but how some of the the writers that she's working with, that she's shared your work with, the whole rural aspect of it has really like they've identified with that. And I felt that same way. I'm from rural Vermont, central Vermont, very different than that area, but in the same way, not, in the same way, I'm surrounded by farms, and a lot of these poems and the connection to land and the connection to history felt very familiar to me. Um, and I wanted to talk a little bit about The Fence Builder. I was so glad that you read that one, because though as you read, there are other poems where the word tamp comes up. This one to me felt really like, oh, there's a central idea. And it really felt for me like that line in which the fence builder says, uh, that he tamps dirt at every level, right? Where that phrase was, and yeah, I tamp the dirt at every level. And so to me, that sort of spoke to this like larger story, I guess, about your father's life and your connection with him, because you talk about, for all who take pride in a task well done. And I'm kind of reading into that is your father, that is something that he taught you, right? And that's kind of how I feel about that poem. And so I'm wondering if you could speak about the word tamp and what that meant to you titling this book and how that connected to some of the themes that you're writing about.
Yeah, I feel so lucky because, of course, that poem was given to me in a sense because this man who had come to dig my father's grave just a couple of days after he died just said this thing that was to him a throwaway statement that struck with me on such a deep level. And part of it was possibly just because of the surrealness of that moment for me, but part of it too was that I started thinking about the way he used that word tamp, and I thought that's not a word that you hear very often, and I thought, how do I know that word? And I immediately realized that I knew it because it was a word my dad had used as he taught me to build fences. It's just I would probably be the only way he would know how to have said, this is what you have to do to the dirt around this post. You've got to tamp it down. And as I wrote the poem and I kept thinking about word more and more, I thought about how the other way that it's typically used, which is we talk about tamping down our emotions, and
Right.
how a lot of this book is me trying to do that in some way, mostly by processing my grief and my loss through the writing. But what I was doing as I was writing was trying to make my emotional sense not be so raw and try to work through traumatic thing that had happened. And so the more that I thought about the word and the more that when I finished that poem, it felt to me so foundational to the book that I quickly thought, well, this has to be what the collection is called. I just never really had a close second possibility for it. And it's interesting because the word has resonated in different ways with people. A lot of people who have said, I don't know what that word means, which is surprising and interesting to me. But I think often people really do know what it means. It's just not a word that they use a lot. And so it's been interesting and fun to hear people respond to it.
And I think of like tamping down explosives too, right? Like that
Yeah,
could also be sort of like that dual meaning of like both, mining the earth or sort of digging through the earth as well as, you
I
know,
think that's a great additional thread to add in there because I do want to draw on the history of coal mining in the family and in the region. And also, again, in the sense that when you lose somebody and it feels so traumatic, that it does feel very explosive too. Even in the case, as I discussed, my father was ill for so long and I was grieving his death before he actually died, it still felt terribly explosive in that moment. So I love, yeah, thank you for adding that too. I
yeah. And
wanted speaking about trauma, I wanted to ask you a little bit about that because you write about so many different sort of traumatic incidents that happen within Feed Me. And I keep a blog page where I try to interview people, writers, when I have the opportunity. And so often when I get the chance, I like to ask people if they have advice for how people can and should go about writing about trauma and how does it benefit them. Do you have advice for other writers who are trying to figure out their stories?
yeah, I mean, first be kind to yourself. Writing about trauma can re-traumatize you and bring up some of those feelings. So I would say, step away from it when you need to. For me, it wasn't always easy to write some of these pieces. There were particular chapters or sections that I had to kind of keep coming back to and put away for a little while and return to just because I wasn't in the right emotional headspace to really process them in that moment. Um, it's it's not easy, like often is this book was probably the hardest thing I've done so far in my life, writing about that. So yeah, I mean, it also is really helpful to have people to process it with, to have support network of people that I could talk through things with when I was, I'm working on this again and this is bringing up, all this stuff and to have that kind of support network and honestly a therapist too to help me process. But yeah, in terms of writing trauma, I think that I mean, I think of like a thing that, I studied fiction at Bennington, but I write in other genres too. Obviously, this is a memoir and I have a poetry collection coming out. And I remember one of the things that Claire Vay Watkins, who was a faculty member at the time when I was there, worked with in fiction, said to me, she said, this thing you're avoiding over here, that's where you need to dig in. And I think that that's often true in my writing anyway, that I don't necessarily know what it really is until I kind of get into it and makes, oh, this is really all about this experience, right? So it all kind of comes back to that. And so I don't know if I really have like great advice for processing it other than just trying to set up the systems in yourself to give you the support you need and to try to be as honest with yourself as you can, and I found that that was a big part of my healing process, writing about things that in some cases I'd never told anyone about, and never really talked about, but like mining those deep, seated moments where things really stemmed from, and trying to make sense of that. And for me, the writing process was ultimately healing, putting that down on the page and then having other people connect with it, and read it and respond to it, was actually a huge part of healing for me as well.
I love that. I feel like that is one of the common things that other writers tell me is about how healing it can be.
Mhm.
I feel like very similar to the idea that writing these poems was definitely healing for me. It helped me understand my emotional state as I was uh, in that area of loss. And it's also been so wonderful to hear readers come in and talk about what different poems mean to them and how they can relate to it. So
Yeah.
I think I'm really happy to hear that because CNF is so scary to me.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of poetry that is so often poetry is autobiographical, right?
Right.
And not that it can't be. My friend Jane Hicks always says, "Never let the truth get in the way of a good poem." I always like that, but poetry is often really biographical, autobiographical, and but it feels different to me. What some of the ways that you have been able to attack these situations in your life is just so raw and honest, and it would be really scary. There were sections that I read in the book that I thought, wow, this is just brutally honest and would be really, really difficult to write. I commend you for that.
Oh, thank you. And it's interesting. One thing I want to talk to you too is about writing across multiple genres. And the first time, one of the experiences I write about in this book is about having an ectopic pregnancy that nearly killed me. And I didn't talk about it all at the time. And I was workshopping with a writers group that I had, workshopping a poem that I thought, "Oh, this is just sort of a lovely little poem about like sitting in front of the fireplace and watching the fire erupt." And I had all these metaphors. I thought I was being clever. And they basically said to me, like, "Yeah, that's nice." But they're like, "But where are you in this? Like, what is it really about?" And I realized in that moment, it was probably about a year after that happened, that it was about the deep depression I was in after having this ectopic pregnancy and going through this really traumatic experience and, bleeding internally and all this stuff that happened, where I just couldn't do much that winter besides curl up in front of this fireplace, and just kind of stare at this fireplace. And so it was things like that where I don't really realize necessarily like what the thing is going to be, and maybe I started as a poem, maybe I started as something else until eventually it becomes the real story that I feel like I can tell. Not that the poem is not a real story, but like the full thing that I feel like I can unpack more. So writing for you, like, do you ever try to do things in different genres? And how do you know, like, going into a piece, what genre you're going to be writing in or what it's going to look like? Or do you kind of like let yourself discover that?
I feel like for me that I typically know when I'm writing a poem or a story, and it has something to do with the way the whatever the first line or the image comes to me in my head that I generally know. But there have been instances where I have realized that something that I thought was a poem is actually just too big in
Mhm.
scope, and it can be a little tricky because a lot of my poems are very narrative to begin with, but like I said, there have just been these instances where I have realized that, there's too much going on here. I'm trying to pack this in and I need a larger canvas. And if I think I can take this idea and make it into something else. But for me, most of the time, I kind of have this sense by the time that the idea comes to me, and between there and when I get to the page, I kind of have a sense of what it's going to be.
Interesting. So I
Not
don't know
always.
his note. I don't know his note. Sometimes I started out one way and it's sort of like what you were saying, like realize, oh, this is too big for this space or for this form, and then it turns into a book. And then but um, I love something that you said a little while ago when we were talking about Fence Builder, about this guy giving a throwaway comment that ended up being like where the title of your book comes from and where a lot of the theme of your book sort of centered around. And I think about that a lot as a writer, how just like little things that happen that, somebody will never remember they said that, or just something I read or something like turns into this piece that I end up wrestling with like for years, like there's this little piece of thing that I found, or maybe it's an image or an idea or something somebody said, like I often will sit with me and then much later become something. And wondering if you can talk kind of about like, where do your poems come from? Like do they start sometimes as little bits of stories that you feel like, or a line or an image or something that you want to explore more?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So often it comes from maybe an observation, just something that I've seen, or maybe a line of speech that I overhear somebody saying. I mean, I try to practice being a good writer and eavesdrop as much as I can. So sometimes people say these wonderful things, they have no idea, that what they're saying has maybe some extra meaning to someone who they think is not paying attention. And sometimes just from other things that I read, a certain word or a line will take me down a pathway that's very different than what the writer of the original piece is,
Mhm.
but strikes this idea and I just maybe can't let it go. And I just keep digging in and exploring it and see where it takes me.
Yeah. And another thing I noticed about some of your poems is sort of the mythology of them and sort of and I think in one of the poems you read, you actually talked about the word mythology, I think in genealogy, but it feels like some of these are sort of folk stories or myths or in some ways sort of feel familiar, in the best way, in that it feels like, oh, I understand this story, right? And I wonder if you could speak about that and kind of about the role of fable or mythology or or however you kind of perceive of these elements of
Yeah.
your poems.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I wanted to, so I mean, a lot of these poems were obviously about my dad, but as the collection grew and I started seeing how it could work, I wanted to also explore other ideas beyond just him and my relationship to him. And one of those was the whole father-son paradigm.
Mhm.
And that I think one reason that these poems are connecting with certain readers is because they've lost their own fathers. And so it's such this, this very common thread that they can say, oh, I totally understand this emotion. And so there is this natural kind of mythology around that sense of loss. And also we tend to mythologize our fathers or our parents in different ways, whether it's a negative or positive, depends on the relationship. But I wanted to also explore ideas about how I was consciously building that mythology around my dad also. So in genealogy, by there's I think there are several things that are happening in that poem, but by tracing this lineage back to the stars, I am also attempting to make him a larger than life character, which he was in some ways already, but this
Right.
is me trying to do it in a different way.
Yeah.
Talking about parents, I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about your family's reaction to Feed Me. I think as I said, one of the difficult things about CNF out of so many is that, um, you know, people read it and then sort of have this insight that you're maybe not always ready for, right? How did
Right.
that go?
Oh my gosh, I was so nervous leading up to this book coming out for that reason, specifically with my mother. And so for anyone who isn't familiar with the book, it's my story at being a memoir, and it's largely about coping with my bipolar disorder and eating disorder. But it's also my mother's story, and processing her alcohol addiction and dealing with a very complicated relationship that we have. And I talked about it with her beforehand with several family members, and and I had the support of the whole family and everyone who kind of felt like we need to talk about this, and we need to not be afraid to tell our own stories because of the way that she may react or we may be perceived, and I talked with her about that. I said, alcohol addiction and mental illness and some of the things that we've, faced are very common things. And, we're not doing anyone any favors, least of all ourselves, by not talking openly about them and trying to kind of hide them. And that's always the way she's been. And I was kind of like, well, I'm going to tell my story, and this is a part of it. She did come to my book launch in December. She showed up 45 minutes late, but she came after the reading part. And I told her I wasn't going to read anything that would be offensive to her in any way. And as soon as she sat down, someone asked a question about how my mother reacted, or if I felt that she wasn't very present emotionally for me or something. And I just kind of turned to my mom, and I, like, oh no. But I think I handled it okay. I talked to my dad a few days later. I told what I said at the reading, and what I have said to her is that I just really, really hope that my love for her and for my family came through in the book. And that, any of the struggles we've been through don't negate that at all. And that, there are so many ways in which she was supportive. And, I had a great childhood in a lot of ways, but there are ways that she wasn't able to sort of emotionally be present for herself or for anyone else. And she's still struggling with that. But so that was a week before Christmas was my book launch, and my dad called me that week and was like, "Hey, like, your mom's kind of upset." And I said, "Oh, because of the book?" He goes, "I don't think she's read the book, but she just doesn't like that questions were about her at all. She doesn't like that attention on her." And so he said, just so you know, and you're not wondering why you get the Ice Queen treatment on Christmas. And I was like, "Dad, no one's ever wondering why they get the Ice Queen treatment with her. Like, that's just part of what we all know, so I was like, I'm not going to hide these things anymore, and so it's good. I mean, we haven't talked about it a lot because she doesn't like to talk a lot about emotions and things. And we had a teary conversation Christmas morning, which there were a lot of hugs and I love yous, and that was it. And so I don't really talk that much about it. I let her kind of bring anything forth. I do think, it's hard writing about family and people you're close to, right? And I did have a lot of conversations with all of the people that appear in the book, about that, and to give them the opportunity to read if they wanted to. But in the most part, my family was just very supportive, and my aunts did read it beforehand, and the book is dedicated to them and my mother. My mother and her sister do not talk, but so I'm sort of a go-between. But I felt like it was just time to tell my story, and I felt like I couldn't be afraid of it because of the way people were going to react. And I did my best to tell it honestly and to be candid about my own struggles and flaws as much as anyone else's, and in no way is meant to be an indictment of anyone, but just to kind of show that, you can get through this, and here are some of the tools that have helped me, and writing has been one of those tools. And so I think it was a story I needed to tell.
That's great. Max, I think I saw you pop in, right?
Oh yeah, do
Did
you have
pop
something?
in, and you asked, half of it has been answered. David was asking about if you each had people you wish would not read your book. And Erika, I think that you hope that your mother would, from what I gave from that answer. Denton, do you have anything you want to add to that briefly?
Um, I, I was uncomfortable with my mom reading this book about my dad because I knew it would be sad for her in some ways, but she was really cute about it. When she when she first got the book and I gave it to her, she actually read the entire thing in front of me and was asking questions. What did this really happen? What is it? I don't remember this. And she's been super supportive and really loves it and feels like it's a really uh, a great tribute to my dad. And Erika, you were much kinder to your family because I did not show these poems to her ahead of time. I just said, I mean, I knew that it wasn't there wasn't the sort of there weren't any poems that were really negative. or portrayed my dad in a bad light. But there were some poems that, of course, draw on my mom as well. And I didn't give her that opportunity to say, is that okay? Because I just thought, well, I'm just writing this no matter what. And she was really wonderful about it. And she was okay. So not so much with this book, but there definitely have been other poems and stories that I have felt the need to write and have wished that nobody would actually read. But, you know, you do what you do, right?
Thank you for that wonderful answer. You were both so incredible tonight. Your words are wonderful and they're so meaningful to our writing community. Thank you for joining us here tonight.
Thank you
Thanks
so
for
much.
having us.
Yeah, and so everybody look out for the recording of this amazing event. And we want to wish you all a good night.
Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thanks, Denton.
Thank you, Erica. Thanks, Max and Kat. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
bye.